The courtroom was ordinary in every way that mattered. Wooden benches worn smooth by decades of nervous hands. Fluorescent lights humming above a room full of people who had somewhere else to be. Providence Municipal Court on a Tuesday morning looked exactly the way Tuesday mornings in municipal courts always look: tired, routine, and completely unremarkable. Until he walked in. The door opened and the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a room changes when something enters it that doesn't belong. A shift in the air, a turn of heads, a collective pause that nobody planned and nobody could explain. A clerk dropped her pen. A bailiff straightened without being told to. 3 people in the back row leaned forward at the same moment without knowing the others had done the same thing. Clint Eastwood stood in the doorway of a municipal courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island, holding a folded piece of paper. He was in his 80s, tall, still carrying the kind of stillness that most men spend their whole lives trying to manufacture and never quite manage. The face that had stared down villains on 100 screens was calm, composed. The way a man looks when he has made a decision he is completely sure of and has nothing left to argue with himself about. He found a seat in the gallery and sat down. He didn't look around the room. He didn't acknowledge the stares. He simply waited, the way he had always waited, like a man who understood that some things could not be rushed and had stopped trying to rush them a long time ago. Nobody in that courtroom knew exactly why he was there. But every single person in that room understood, without being told, that whatever had brought Clint Eastwood to a small courthouse in Providence on a Tuesday morning was not small. And they were right. If you've ever watched someone set down everything they'd spent a lifetime carrying, stay with this story. Because what happened in that courtroom that morning was something nobody who witnessed it ever forgot. Frank Caprio had been sitting behind that bench for more years than most people in his courtroom had been alive. He had seen everything a municipal court could show a man. He had seen the frightened and the defiant, the guilty and the wrongly accused, the people who deserved mercy and the people who needed consequences, and the far larger group who needed someone to simply look at them and see a human being instead of a case number. He had grown up with nothing. The son of an Italian immigrant laborer in Federal Hill, Providence, Caprio had shined shoes as a boy and sold newspapers in weather that had no interest in the comfort of a child who needed to make money. He had watched his father work himself to exhaustion for wages that were never quite enough and carry that exhaustion home every night without complaint and without explanation, because men of that generation did not explain themselves. They simply endured. His father never saw him become a judge. That fact lived somewhere behind Caprio's eyes every single day he sat on the bench. Every person who stood before him carried, in some way, the face of the man his father had been, someone the system had never quite looked at directly. Caprio had made a decision a long time ago that in his courtroom, that would be different. He was not famous for being strict. He was not famous for being lenient. He was famous for being honest, for asking the question nobody else bothered to ask, for understanding that a parking fine meant something different to a woman choosing between that fine and her child's medication than it meant to someone who would never notice it left their account. Clint Eastwood sat in the gallery and watched Caprio work through the morning's cases. He watched an elderly man struggle to explain a registration violation and watched Caprio lean forward and listen the way people listen when they actually intend to hear. He watched a young woman nearly in tears and watched Caprio speak to her quietly and watched the tears stop. He sat with his hands folded and the folded piece of paper resting on his knee, and he watched all of it with the complete, reading attention of a man who was seeing something he recognized and had not expected to find here. The paper on his knee was not his own violation. It belonged to a man named Ray. Ray Molina had worked beside Clint Eastwood for 30 years. Not in front of cameras, not in the credits that audiences read while the theater emptied. He worked in the space between takes and the hours before sunrise and the long drives between locations that nobody filmed and nobody remembered except the 2 men sitting in the vehicle. He was a crew member, a logistics man, the person who made sure everything that needed to happen happened, and made sure the people who needed to be somewhere were there, and made sure that when something went wrong, and something always went wrong, it got handled quietly before anyone important noticed. He had received a municipal business license violation. A regulation had changed, and Ray hadn't known. The fine attached to it was not enormous. But the violation, left on record, threatened the small transport business he had built after retiring from film work. The business that was supposed to be his next chapter. The thing he had worked toward for 3 decades while working toward everything else first. Ray had not called Clint. He had not asked for anything. He never did. Clint had found out the way he always found out about things involving people he paid attention to, not because they told him, but because he noticed. When Clint Eastwood's name was called, the courtroom went still in the particular way that rooms go still when something unprecedented is happening and everyone present understands it simultaneously. He stood. He walked to the front. He was unhurried. He stopped before the bench and looked up at Frank Caprio, and Caprio looked back at him with the same expression he gave everyone, direct, patient, and entirely without performance. Caprio said he knew who he was. He said it the way a man says something when he wants the other person to understand that it changes nothing. Clint nodded once. He understood completely. He made his request clearly. He asked Caprio to dismiss the violation against Ray Molina. Not reduce it, not defer it. Dismiss it. He said Ray was an honest man who had made an honest mistake, and that 30 years of honest work ought to count for something in a courtroom that seemed to believe people were more than their paperwork. Caprio listened without interrupting. He looked at the file. He looked at Clint. Then he set the file down and folded his hands and said what he had to say. He could not dismiss it. The violation was documented, and due process required a ruling. He was not able to give Ray Molina something he would not give anyone else who walked through that door. That was not how his courtroom worked. That had never been how his courtroom worked. And the fact that the man standing before him had made 50 films and was recognized in every country on earth did not change the file, did not change the regulation, and did not change what the bench required of him. The room waited. Every person in it was watching Clint Eastwood's face. They were waiting for the cold stare. The silence that could make a director back down from across a set. The stillness that had always been the warning before the storm. For 3 full seconds, Clint Eastwood said nothing. And in those 3 seconds, every person in that courtroom forgot to breathe. He didn't argue. That was the first thing that surprised the room. There was no pushback, no invoking of names or favors or the particular entitlement that fame tends to grow in people who carry it long enough. He simply stood there for those 3 seconds and let whatever was moving through him move through him completely. And then he spoke. His voice was quiet. The voice everyone in that room recognized from decades of films was stripped of everything that made it famous. No edge, no authority, no performance layered underneath the words to make them land harder. Just a man speaking plainly because plain was all he had left, and plain, it turned out, was enough. He told Caprio about Ray, not the Ray on the violation form. The Ray he knew. He said Ray had driven him to the hospital twice in 20 years. Once at 2 a.m. when Clint had been too proud to call anyone who might tell someone else. Once on a Sunday afternoon when the situation was serious enough that pride stopped mattering. Both times Ray had shown up within 15 minutes and had not asked a single question and had sat in waiting rooms for hours without complaint and had driven him home after and had never mentioned it again to another living person. He said Ray had been present at 2 funerals that Clint had attended largely alone. People he had loved and lost at points in his life when his world and the people in it were complicated in ways that made grief a private business. Ray had stood beside him both times without being asked, had said almost nothing, had simply been there in the specific way that presence matters most. Not as comfort exactly, but as evidence that a person is not as alone as they sometimes believe. Then Clint's voice dropped further. The courtroom leaned in without meaning to. He said Ray was the only person in his life who had never wanted anything from him. Not a photograph, not a story to tell at dinner, not a connection to someone Ray needed to reach, not a single favor in 30 years. He said that when you spent your life being famous, you learned very quickly to read the moment someone wanted something from you before they asked for it. You developed a kind of permanent low-level vigilance that never fully switched off. And he said that Ray had never once triggered it. Not once in 30 years. He paused. The room was completely silent. Then he said the words that froze everyone present. He said he'd spent his whole life playing men who didn't need anyone. He said he had believed it for a long time. He said it had felt like strength when he was young and had felt like discipline when he was middle-aged and had only recently started to feel like what it actually was the loneliest lie he had ever told himself. And he said that Ray, without ever saying a word about it, without ever making it a lesson or a conversation or a moment, had taught him that. Just by showing up. Just by being the one person in 30 years who proved that some people appear in your life without an agenda and stay without a contract and give without a ledger. He said he was not standing before the bench because he believed his name meant something in this courtroom. He had watched Caprio work for the past hour, and he understood perfectly well that it didn't. He was standing there because Ray would never stand there for himself, because asking for help was not something Ray knew how to do, and because after 30 years of man showing up for him, somebody needed to show up for Ray. He stopped talking. He stood with his hands at his sides. His voice had not broken, but it had come close enough that everyone in the room heard exactly how close it had come. Judge Caprio looked at Clint Eastwood for a long moment. Then he looked down at the file. When he looked up again, something in his expression had shifted, and what he said next, nobody expected either. Caprio called Ray Molina forward. Not Clint, not the lawyers, not the file. Ray, the man himself, the small, quiet man who had been sitting in the second row with his hands clasped and his eyes on the floor, trying to take up as little space as possible in a room where someone had already taken up a great deal of space on his behalf. Ray stood and walked to the front and stopped beside Clint, and Caprio looked at him the way Caprio looked at everyone who stood before his bench, directly, without judgment already formed, with the specific patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that the most important information was usually the last thing people said, not the first. He asked Ray one question. He asked whether Ray had done the work he was accused of cutting corners on. The room waited. It was the kind of question that had two possible answers, and everyone present understood that the answer Ray gave would matter more than anything else said that morning. More than Clint's speech, more than the file, more than the regulation that had changed without notice. Ray looked up at Caprio. He said yes, he had done the work. He said the regulation had changed 6 months prior, and he had not known, and that when he found out he had corrected everything immediately at his own expense. He said he understood that not knowing was not the same as being excused. He said he was sorry. That was all he said. Caprio nodded slowly. He looked at the file one more time. Then he closed it. He reduced the violation to a formal warning. He waived the fine entirely. He granted the continuation of Ray's business license without condition. He said that honest mistakes made by honest men who corrected those mistakes without being forced to were precisely what his courtroom existed to distinguish from the other kind. He said the record would reflect a warning and nothing more. The room exhaled. Then Caprio did something that nobody had anticipated. He looked up from the file, and he looked directly at Clint Eastwood, and he spoke to him from the bench in a voice that was calm and certain and carried the specific weight of a man, saying something he meant completely. He said that what Clint had said about his friend, he should write that down somewhere. He said it was the truest thing spoken in his courtroom in a long time. He said that a man who could stand in front of strangers and speak that kind of truth about another person was not someone who had wasted his years, whatever else he believed about himself. Clint stood very still, the way men stand when something has reached them that they were not prepared to receive, and they're trying to hold themselves together by remaining completely motionless. His jaw tightened slightly. His eyes did not move from Caprio's face. Ray sat down in the front row and covered his face with both hands. His shoulders moved once. Then he was still. The courtroom was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last. Then the next case was called, and the room remembered where it was, and life continued forward the way life always continues, indifferent to the things that just changed inside people and carrying everyone toward the next hour regardless. If this story is reminding you of someone in your life who has always shown up without asking for anything in return, share this with them today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. The hallway outside the courtroom was narrow and smelled of old wood and floor polish, and the particular quiet of a building that processed difficult things all day and had learned not to carry them home at night. Clint and Ray stood near the door. Ray tried to speak. He got 2 words out before Clint stopped him with a look that was not unkind, but was completely firm. He told Ray that he had been showing up for 30 years without being asked, and without being thanked, and without making a single thing about himself in all that time. He told him not to thank him for one morning. He said it the way people say things when they need the other person to understand that the accounting between them runs in only one direction and always has. Ray nodded. He looked at the floor. He was not a man who cried easily, and he was working hard at that particular task in that particular moment. Caprio came through the hallway a few minutes later on his way back to Chambers. He was still in his robe. He slowed when he saw them, and then stopped. He looked at Clint, and Clint looked back at him, and something passed between them in the wordless way that things pass between people who came from the same raw material and built very different lives from it, and know it about each other within seconds of being in the same room. Caprio said he hadn't needed to come. Clint said he had. Caprio accepted that with a single nod. They shook hands, briefly and firmly and without ceremony. 2 men from nothing who had spent their lives building something and understood without discussing it exactly what that cost and exactly what it was worth. Clint walked Ray to his truck. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He had already said everything. Ray Molina opened his business the following Wednesday morning the same way he had opened it every morning for years. Quietly, without ceremony. He unlocked the door and turned the lights on and started the work. The violation was a footnote now, a warning on a form that would sit in a file that nobody would ever look at again. The business continued. The next chapter he had worked 30 years toward was still his. Months later, Frank Caprio stood before his courtroom on an ordinary afternoon and addressed a defendant who reminded him of someone he didn't name. He told that defendant that the most courageous thing he had ever seen in his courtroom was not a dramatic defense or a complicated argument. It was a man who had spent his entire life convinced that needing nobody was the same as being strong, and who had walked into a small courthouse one Tuesday morning and told the truth about how wrong he had been. He said that man had never asked for the ruling he wanted, but he had received something the ruling couldn't have given him anyway. The defendant nodded slowly. He wasn't sure he understood completely, but something in the room felt heavier and more honest than it had a moment before. Outside on the street, Providence moved forward the way cities move, without pausing, without acknowledging what happened inside any particular building on any particular morning. The traffic continued. The Tuesday became a Wednesday. The world carried on. But somewhere, a man named Ray was driving to work. And somewhere, the man who had shown up for him was a little less alone than he had been the day before. And that, in the end, was the whole story. That was all of it. That was enough. If this story moved you, share it with someone who has always shown up for you without being asked. Leave a comment below about the person in your life who is your Ray. And if you believe that real strength is knowing when to show up for someone else, subscribe now. More stories like this one are waiting for you.